afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvin-Almanza. So in Raleigh, North Carolina, there is a race heating up that if you are not from there, might not be at the top of your mind. But this is a city of nearly 500,000 people, a city run by a Democratic mayor in an otherwise red Republican state, incredibly diverse, young, a median age of only 34 years old. And last summer, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, Raleigh underwent its own reckoning, with the current mayor, Mary Bowman, taking steps to reform policing in her city. Change, though, has been elusive, and I think the same could be said of many cities across the country, reacting in this way to that event. Advocacy groups in Raleigh, though, have complained that the city's leadership is stuck in the mud, and also that there is a general lack of governmental transparency, which is preventing Raleigheites from seeing the kind of transformation in public safety that they are seeking. In addition, housing advocates have pointed out that Mayor Bowman's cozy ties with developers in a city where the cost of housing is rapidly outstripping the average income is creating a crisis on the horizon. Mayor Bowman is running for her second term in October's election. But as of January, she is now facing a challenge from a professor of social work who also directs a social justice foundation, the Justice Loves Foundation. His name is Terrance Ruth, and we're very pleased to have a chance to sit down with him today and discuss his platform, his views, and why he is running to be the top executive in Raleigh. Professor Ruth, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So you've said in prior interviews that you are not running because of Mayor Bowman, but because of a broader concern about the lack of public trust in city government. And I'm wondering if you could be very concrete for our viewers about how that impetus for you translates into action. So speaking very concretely and tactically, like what are the top 3 things that would make you different from Mayor Bowman if elected?
No, thank you again, Emily, for allowing me to be on your show. My campaign, number 1, has 4 goals. I want to restore transparency. I want to be inclusive in the city work, and I'm considering the impacts of all members in our city. And I want to reestablish trust between our community and the position of mayor. Citizens must be able to trust their mayor. That's baseline for me. But likewise, the mayor must trust the citizens and listen when they voice their concerns. So we have endured, as you mentioned, a very tough year. And through it all, the current mayor has fostered division by making decisions without regard for the public's view and appearing to, in my opinion, to favor one segment of our population over another. This is where I will lead differently. I will be present. I will listen to everyone, and I will involve many views transparently in my decisions. There are 3 issues that I consider critical to rebuilding trust and fostering a united Raleigh. Number 1, I will re-implement a strong community engagement strategy that invites balance and accountability throughout the city. Right now, if we do not build a platform where the community feel that they can hold our elected officials accountable, I think we will have a difficult time rebuilding the trust that was lost last year. Second, I will provide an aggressive leadership strategy around affordable housing. Right now, we're already in a deficit. COVID has also put us behind the 8 ball. And right now, if we're not in an aggressive land acquisition and land preservation, we are going to see where the lack of affordability will make us unattractive as a city. And then third, the audience that have probably been most aggressive in my campaign is the small business support. If you look at our downtown, it's our small business community has been ravaged. And we're not even talking about the outside of that downtown unit that has advocacy groups to represent them. The larger Raleigh has small businesses that are hurting real bad right now. And so for me, I think my leadership in being present in small business community efforts, thinking across the region how we can support small business efforts. I think that the efforts that I put forward, my resume and the relationship I bring to the position and experience will make that possible. Looking forward to a very difficult recovery.
So you mentioned that the mayor favors certain groups. I'm wondering if you could just briefly say who is being favored right now, and who would you elevate if elected, and how?
Well, hopefully, the desire of any position is to elevate community voice. Hopefully, the position of any elected official is to empower those who actually cast their vote for you, and those who did not. What are their concerns? Hopefully, as an elected official, you are trying to listen, be present, and hear what the community is asking for, and represent that at the table where you're negotiating development deals, at the table in which you're negotiating contracts, at the table where you're negotiating accountability and transparency across data. Hopefully, for any elected official, the audience, the group, the stakeholders that you're representing is the community, and the community that voted for you.
Got it. So speaking of the community, I want to dig into a few of the discrete issues that are sort of at play here. I'm going to start with policing. Critics have called Mayor Baldwin's Police Accountability Board a paper tiger, and they've argued that changes since last summer have been cosmetic rather than fundamental. I'm wondering if you could get very tactical. Our viewers are generally, I can't say everybody's from Raleigh, but generally they are very informed about and interested in the intricacies of transforming policing in America. So what would you say the most urgent work on that is in your city? And what would you do as mayor to make concrete changes to transform the relationship between the community and the police, or transform the way policing happens?
Well, first, my background sits in K through 12 education, alternative education, where most of my experience was tied closely to kids who were suspended or was engaged in the criminal justice system. So I have relationships in community around this work, and also I have relationships with leaders in the law enforcement who are trying to engage community at a very deep level. I would like for us to zoom out just a little bit. If you look at Cary is really undergoing some deep level work around community policing, looking at the Obama task force. They're going a deep dive with their staff, not just equity training, but they're actually reevaluating policies. They're actually going through a deep dive, and soon they're going to come out and actually engage the community on a very deep level around what does it mean to have police accountability? What does it mean to have solid, positive, strong community relationship between the police? If you look at Durham, same thing. We have local examples. We don't even have to leave the state, but we can. There's examples across the country. What we need to do at this point, number one, there must be an authentic relationship of trust, transparency, and truth between the mayor and the community, so that the mayor can represent the community well when engaging law enforcement. Also, there must be a relationship between the mayor and policing that stands around transparency, truth, and trust, so that when policies are made, it's made so that we're not concentrating high levels of poverty in one area, or that we are making sure that there's access to jobs, so we don't have concentrated areas of our city where there are families who, if born in that zip code, will not make more than $20,000 a year. We must engage with law enforcement so we're not designing policy that will allow for a concentration of those who don't have access to transportation, those who do not have access to education, and those who have not have access to housing. Policing must start with good policy. Now, once you move beyond good policy, I believe that transparency is needed for us to bridge the relationship between policing and community. What we have seen in the recent months is that Police Accountability Board felt that there was no transparency, that they were not able to operate with a level of independence. And so what we've seen is key individuals on that board resign, and it's not even a year old. And so we're seeing where there's a theme of lack of transparency that sits across several issues in this city. And I think the first step is being able to have an authentic relationship with community, being able to roll out a authentic plan to have transparent data and connection between policing and community. And right now, I think we are lacking on those principles.
Let's get really detailed. I forgive me. I'm the kind of person who learns about machines by taking them apart and putting them back together. When you describe something to me, sometimes I don't follow. I need to hold the gears in my hand. So when you say, having the community at the table, what is that? Like monthly meetings between the mayor and community members? Is it a formal advisory board? Is it when you talk about transparency, is that like an online database that communities can log into to see policing data? Is it monthly disclosures by the police department? Like, what are the mechanisms that you would use?
Well, first, your question, Emily, is a wonderful question. Number one, Clarence Leitner, the first African American mayor in the city of Raleigh, platform, and that community engagement platform represented all aspects of the city. They met monthly, and they were able to engage on rezoning cases. They had a police representative come and meet and discuss what's going on in that particular region of the city. They had an opportunity for community to give their concerns. They also had an opportunity for the community to embrace new members. When you look at transparency in terms of data, when we talk about policing and what changes we need to make, we embrace big data on everything else. We embrace big data on education. We embrace big data even when we're driving cars, how long have we gone, et cetera. But we do not embrace big data in terms of policing. How many times do a police interact with a human being each day? What is our goal to reduce that engagement? What does it mean to look at stops according to race and income? How do we then reduce that? How do we, engage deeply in the data? We are in the RTP. We're in a research triangle. We have evaluators and researchers all over the place. We are next door to NC State, one of the greatest research institutions in the triangle in this state. They have research and evaluators that's ready to engage. What we are asking for is standard data-driven strategy, data-driven evaluation that currently we do not have. And the community, in my opinion, when I sit in these different meetings, the community is clearly asking just for standard data-driven practices and strategy.
So let me ask you a little bit about that, because you've said in past interviews that you don't see Raleigh city government as needing to be a leader in this conversation. You are interested in adopting the best practices that you've researched from other jurisdictions. And I think one thing I want to kind of drill down on is when you talk about partnership between police and communities, there are a number of programs across the country, like in Denver's STAR program, Eugene, Oregon's Cahoots program, Oakland's new macro program, where they are moving funding away from police and toward community emergency response, finding amazing results. How dramatically low numbers of arrests, resulting in a lot of conflict resolution and public safety without policing happening in these cities. I know that your field is social work. So I know that there's been a temptation in Raleigh to talk about police accompanying social workers. But I guess my question for you is, do you need to think bigger? If you look around the country and best practices suggest actually replacing police with trained civilians, would that be something you would adopt?
One, before you move to grander ideas around the relationship and bridging community to policing, we can't overlook the significance of the trust that must be embedded in local officials. In the absence of that, the mayor cannot advocate on behalf of the community. And it's very hard to make the table in which community and policing come together to collaborate around next ideas. So right now, unfortunately, Raleigh is at the point where we are looking for ways to just build trust to where both groups can be at the table. But there are best practices. NC State just held compassionate policing, a national conference that looked at what does it mean to train officers and social workers around compassionate policing that looks at officers that are not in uniform. A representative from the Raleigh Police was there. And so there are strategies that are possible in Raleigh. But we're at a point in Raleigh where trust is critical. And right now we don't have that. And so for me, I would hesitate to look beyond how significant this moment is right now.
Okay, so moving on from policing, it's good to have clarity about keeping police at the table rather than alternative methods. So let's go talk about housing. Obviously, housing and urban development are major issues in this race. So I guess let's start with a major piece that I know you've talked about a lot of your campaign, which is affordable housing was a centerpiece of Mayor Baldwin's initial campaign. You have embraced faith-based affordable housing. Can you explain for people not from Raleigh what that is and why that's your choice?
Actually, it's not a Raleigh-based idea. So if you look across the country, Enterprise, several other organizations similar to Enterprise, which are national organizations, they have faith-based affordable housing initiatives that is really not unique to Raleigh. Prior to any prior to any affordable housing efforts, what the research have shown is that the faith-based community stood in that place without any regulations, rules, policy, or funding. The faith-based community stood in that place. The reason why this is a good idea is because the faith-based community actually holds the most property in the city. And theoretically, the faith-based community also serves those who would be in the most need of housing. And so I think that group leading the conversation can allow for us to think much more aggressively and think much further down in the future around affordable housing rather than just this $80 million bond.
So I guess I have a question as someone who probably lacks the level of familiarity with faith-based affordable housing as sort of a category. But the immediate question that comes to mind for me is accessibility. Does an embrace of faith-based affordable housing create a world in which certain forms of equity for people who may be excluded traditionally from certain faith communities? I'm thinking trans people, gender non-conforming people, people who are not members of any of the faith or may have practices in their own life which are not accepted in one of the religious organizations involved in this. Is that going to create a barrier to affordable housing?
To this point, the research haven't sort of borne out the idea that those who need housing was discriminated against when it was led by faith communities. I don't even think that was a category in terms of engaging those who are homeless or in need of housing. Second, if you know anything about the history of Raleigh, especially downtown Raleigh, it sort of sits on this rich soil of faith community and activism, where you've seen a series of marches for several years. You can go back to the organizing that happened on Shaw campus years ago, where Martin Luther King would come and visit, or you can go to more contemporary times where Dr. Barber started the More Mondays. So you have this rich soil of religious leaders really fighting for change, equity, diversity, that also includes all people of Raleigh. So we fortunately have a much more, foundation around social justice that most cities are deprived of. And so our legacy here in Raleigh in particular leans on faith leaders who have experienced the More Mondays, who have experienced massive march by the by the teacher association. We had one of the largest marches last year or the year before. So I don't think that we have the same concerns in terms of access or equity or inclusion in Raleigh if we are led by the faith community that has been here historically.
So continuing on the housing question, reflecting on the CDC's current eviction moratorium, for a lot of people who've fallen behind on rent, that moratorium has staved off an eviction crisis until June, the eviction cliff, as some people call it. But in Raleigh, a lot of people haven't had that staved off because landlords are finding workarounds where they will end a lease. Instead of doing an eviction for non-payment of rent, they will simply decline to renew a lease, which is causing people to get kicked out of their housing in the middle of a pandemic. Now, we've been talking to a lot of cities across the country who've implemented a right to housing or right to counsel in housing court in eviction proceedings and have seen substantial drops in eviction. I think one example was a 93% success rate for tenants who were provided counsel by their city or county government. I'm wondering, when we talk about really tactical changes you might make, and your interest in looking at examples from around the country, do you think that providing lawyers for people who are at risk of being evicted is something that you would be open to as mayor?
One, our work with the Justice Love Foundation was a part of an invitation by community leaders where they live around reducing and eliminating evictions for individuals in Raleigh. So I just want to give just credit and a notice to those community leaders and activists who are living in this space every day. And they have been advocating for behalf of their neighbors, their friends, and their family. But I do think that, one, this issue is much larger than the eviction. And I also think that this issue is directly linked to our policy around housing. We can provide affordable housing or we can stave off evictions, but we must give people an opportunity to reach that next stage in the ladder for housing, to where they are now stable in housing. Right now, the only conversation we're having is around housing that will stave off an eviction or housing that will allow for somebody to afford to live there. What we are seeing is that once somebody has housing or that eviction has been staved off for the next month or series of months, we still have to address a much deeper issue. And the issue sits around education. The issues sits around access, workforce development, access to jobs, not just those that are six figures, but how are we allowing for families to take care of themselves in a season where we've seen just a massive drop in employment? Transportation. How are we allowing for individuals to get to and from work without that leaning on the backs of small business owners who are trying to find employees and stay alive? And so I think even if we address the issue of eviction, I think the conversation must start much deeper than that.
There's so much you've said here that's absolutely like a valid and insightful unpacking of the sort of mechanisms at play. But I guess if I'm trying to represent like the voter who wants to know, do you support a right to counsel in housing court?
For me, I do. And the reason why I do, number one, I think that it's a way in which we can have accountability. If you hear anything I say, number one, I want to be held accountable. Number two, I want transparency, which is linked to accountability. Three, if we have both of those, then I want you to trust me. And then on my behalf, I want to be able to trust the community. And then on the last part, I want us to operate on a level of truth. This is what's law. This is what we should be doing, and this is what's right. And I think that being able to have an element of accountability, not just in certain areas within the city, but across all areas in the city, I think will help us go a long way in terms of building trust between our mayor position and also the community itself.
So, last question. I'm very excited by the idea of the sort of trust and close relationship building that you're talking about, but I want to stay really, really tactical on policy. So I'm going to ask one last question before we have to go. Sometimes the best solution to poverty-related problems is money, and there have been cities across the country who have been experimenting with a universal basic income or increasing the minimum wage to a living wage in that community. Just very quickly, do you support universal basic income? Would you entertain that idea? And are you in favor of raising the minimum wage?
Yes to both, but I also think that, again, if we just stay on this topic, we're only touching the surface. The much deeper question beyond just minimum wage is the small business. We know small business employ most of the individuals we're talking about. So how do we create support so that they can provide healthcare to their employees? How do we provide support so that we can provide transportation to their employees? How do we provide support to small businesses so that they can afford a minimum wage for employees. Usually this conversation is held for larger corporations like Amazon and Google. But how do we make sure that we support small business in this city so that they can provide for their employees, and also that we create an environment that really supports that idea? Again, even if we zoom in locally, Durham has already moved forward in this effort. And so we don't have to look far away. And so it's time for Raleigh to start leading on certain issues. And so you bring up a good point, but that's just the surface. There's much deeper needs, and all you have to do is be present and talk to small business leaders. And they have informed me quite a bit of what they need to really recover, not just recover, but to have a healthy small business network and community in the city of Raleigh.
Well, Professor Ruth, thank you so much for joining us. This has been really, really illuminating. I look forward to following this campaign, this election. I understand that the vote will be held in October. So, of course, I wish you the best of luck and look forward to seeing how this all goes.
Thank you.
Take care. So there you have it, folks. If you weren't paying attention to Raleigh, you should be paying attention to Raleigh. We just spoke with Professor Ruth, who's running for mayor in that city. We will be covering, of course, all of these elections. We're going to be interviewing the candidates. You can follow us here. You can listen to what people really think on The Appeal Live. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. Thank you so much for joining us.